or an app or anything like that, open up to 2 Kings chapter 3. It's probably a passage that you didn't even know existed, but that's where we're going to be launching today. But before we dive into Scripture, I think we probably have to answer the question, why are there paper airplanes on the staff t-shirts? Why are there paper airplanes in the lobby? Why are there paper airplanes on the stage? Like, what does this have to do with this idea of you in 5 years? And here's the thing, when we think about a paper airplane and you think about the flight path of where a paper airplane is going to go, there are a few different contributing factors that play a part. The first one we'll call the current. That's kind of the surroundings, right? Like if you throw a paper airplane in a tornado versus in like an actual vacuum, you're gonna have two totally different flight patterns. If you throw it into a fan as opposed to beside a fan, the current, the outside forces, the things beyond its control are gonna shape the way that it flies. Another thing that has to do with the structure or the flight pattern of a paper airplane is really like it's the material. This is cheating a little bit, but when you think about a paper airplane, if I threw this paper airplane once it's done from here, it might go all the way, like I might be able to send it all the way to like 3 or 4 rows back. If I made an airplane out of sheet metal and threw it from right here, it might send the front row to the hospital just as efficiently. Like what it's made out of is gonna determine how well it flies. But the thing is with paper airplanes, like, you don't have a whole lot of control over that. Like, yeah, to some extent, you can control what you make it out of, but ultimately, you can't really get a huge control over the situation, right? You can't control the currents. You can't control the wind. You can't control what's happening. You can't control how ugly this paper airplane actually is, but that's beside the point because I made it wrong. The thing that you can control are the small changes in the structure. One tiny little change is going to have a huge effect on where that paper airplane goes. In fact, I made a couple of them because I didn't trust myself to make a paper airplane under such high pressure. Here's the thing. This paper airplane, just like this, just like it's made, if I throw it right here, it's going to go right at that, almost send someone to the hospital anyway. But I've got this one little small change. One fold. One little change in how it is, and it goes a different way. It went from there to there. Now, in a matter of 10 feet, that's not a very big deal. But when you have a paper airplane, if we were to throw it and had the ability to track its trajectory for the next 20 miles, those two paper airplanes, while they start in the same spot, are going to end up miles apart. Not because of a huge change, not because of a huge difference in what they're made of, but because of one small change that was made. One tiny change. And so when we look at this idea of who you are in 5 years, some of you in 5 years, those of you that are freshmen, you're going to be all of you are going to be like in the real world. But think about 5 years from now, some of you all need to do some complex math and guess how many times you're repeating a grade and like how many extra times, and that's fine. But think about who you want to be 5 years from now. And I would argue that the same influences, the same things that change the pattern of a paper airplane affect you as well. I think your life and the trajectory of your life a lot of times gets shaped by the current. Get shaped by the outside forces outside of your control. This is not fair and it is not right, but the fact of the matter is, if your parents don't love Jesus, or if your family is hostile to you, if you're in an abusive situation, or even if you're just not in like a great social setting because of your parents' friends or anything like that, there are so many things outside of your control that are going to have a huge impact on who you are in 5 years. But I don't want to spend time preaching and teaching and unpacking like, here's how to change the things that you can't change. Because the answer is you pray a lot. The other thing that's going to impact it is kind of the material. This is like what you're good at, what you struggle with, your strengths and weaknesses, and all of that stuff, your gifting. And here's the deal. We could talk about like, do better, do your best. But ultimately, like, you have no control over your giftings. We'll talk in a second. I loved playing high school football. I was in no danger of going D74, much less like D3 in football. I was very not good at football, no matter how hard I tried. In fact, being not good at football could be one of my spiritual gifts. I'll find out in heaven. It just wasn't going to happen. That's not how God made me. And I don't want to spend a whole series saying, here's how to change the way that God made you and the things that God gave you passions for and giftings for and talents for, because I don't want to go against the way that God designed you. He knows the material that you're made of. He knows your gifts. He knows your strengths. He knows your passions and desires and wiring. And that's going to have a huge impact on who you are in 5 years. What I want to spend some time as we wrap up this semester looking at are what are the changes that you can make, just the tweaks. Just a small change, maybe in your habits or in your life, that right now feel minor. They may feel so insignificant, but if we track the trajectory of your life, I think there are changes that you can make now that will have a great impact on where you are in 5 years. And we could have named this series, You in 30 Years. And like that could be either an awesome or just like so sad series. And we're not gonna do that. It's just 5 years. We're just asking you to think of who you want to be 5 years from now. And for some of you, as we unpack this, it's going to be small changes, right? Like you're already headed this direction and you need to be headed this direction. And so, yes, over 5 years, that's a big deal. But right now, it's like, like that's all, you just need a little, and that's it. And we're going to talk about small changes. For some of you, it's going to be a bigger change. You're like, I need to go this way, and I'm like doing this right now. I'm going nowhere in the right direction. And we're going to talk about that as well. We're going to talk about you need more of like a boom, like a huge redirection in your life. We're going to talk about that. For some of you, it's a one moment thing. Like God, you just need to beg God to come in and absolutely wreck your life and change it, and you're going to be good for that. For others, it's just a habit. Like a daily thing that you need to change that isn't a big deal every day, but what we'll see is over time, it builds. We're going to unpack all of that over the next handful of weeks. And here's the promise that I make to you. Even if you don't love Jesus, even if you don't believe in any of the stuff we're saying, I really believe that the stuff we're going to unpack is universal truth. So for those of you who, man, Jesus isn't for me, I'm glad you're here, and I hope that you would listen, because I think if you still apply the principles that we see in Scripture to your life, you will be a different person in 5 years than you would have been otherwise. And so tonight, as we kind of set the mood and kick things off in 2 Kings chapter 3, it's important for us to know a little bit of what's going on. The first thing is this. We're looking at some prophecy. And the prophet Elisha, he's not talking to us, right? He's not talking to us in 2018. This is a specific thing for a specific people, so I don't want to get too crazy with the application, but I think it gives us some language and some handles on this idea of where we're going to be in 5 years. And the second thing you need to know, and I'll try and make this as simple as possible, a little bit of like historical cultural background, nerd moment for you. Like at this point, as we're diving in, the nation of Israel, which is 12 tribes, is not really 12 tribes right now. Right now, they're divided. There's 10 tribes in Israel, 2 tribes in Judah. They are not buddies. We'll dive into a little bit more of that. For some of you, you're like, dude, I'm tired of biblical worldview class. Make it stop. And for others of you, you didn't know that at all. I just want us all on the same page. There's Israel and Judah. They're both kind of Israel, but they're not right now. And so, as we dive into a bunch of names that you're never going to need to pronounce or anything like that, let's just read the first 3 verses in this chapter. Ahab's son Joram began to rule over Israel in the 18th year of the king Jehoshaphat's reign in Judah. He reigned in Samaria 12 years. Told you so. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, but not to the same extent of his father and mother. He at least tore down the sacred pillar of Baal that his father had set up. Nevertheless, he continued in the sins that Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, had committed and led the people of Israel to commit. Now, pause right there. This is important setup, because in a little bit we're going to see Elisha throw some like major shade at pretty much all of Israel, and we need to know what's happening. Basically, Joram, everybody say Joram. I don't know for sure that's how it's said, but that's what we're all going to just pretend that you say it. Joram, everybody say Joram. Yeah, y'all are still not confident. That's fine. His parents did not serve God. His parents actually led Israel to worship and set up temples and pillars and all kinds of stuff to worship a false god, a pagan god named Baal. And so for some of you, are like, that doesn't sound like God's people in the Old Testament. Yeah, they're pretty jacked up. Like, it's a whole thing. And so his parents worshiped Baal, and he did a little bit better. He helped a little bit, but he still led the people of Israel astray. And that comes up to be a major thing in a second. Basically, long story short, what happens over the next few verses, there's this country, this people group, the Moabites. Everybody say Moabites. Man, you guys are just out of it. Try again. Everybody say Moabites. Moabites. 4 of you picked it up. Yes. So they decide they're going to rebel against the people of Israel. They already conquered the people of Judah. And so the king of Israel says to the king of Judah, hey, you want to go beat them up and like have a war? And he's like, okay. And so at that point, they had an option. Pretend this is a map. You got the Dead Sea right here. Israel and Judah, they could have just gone and attacked Moab. Instead, what they did, and this is so important for this entire passage to understand the geography of what's happening, so don't zone out. Instead of attacking Moab directly, they go around the south side of the Dead Sea through a country named Edom. E-D-O-M, not E-D-E-N from Genesis, Edom. They decided to go around and try and go through Edom, and that is a crucial pivot point in this story because we pick back up in verse 9. It says, the king of Edom and his troops joined them, and all 3 armies traveled along the roundabout route through the wilderness for 7 days. And this is huge. But there was no water for the men or their animals. A 7-day march with 3 armies prepared for battle. Now think about this. That means it's not just like they're hiking Pinnacle and taking a selfie and heading out and like putting a Bible verse on it and posting it. This is a 7-day march. This is pace. This is not you get tired and you just take a break and sit down and chill for a little bit. This is not you're just you've got your athletic wear on and your hiking boots. This is like you've got your tunic and your armor and your weaponry. You've got your pack with your bedroll and maybe a tent. You've got supplies for a march. You've got livestock and support staff. It is a huge column marching through, and there is no water for 7 days. What we're going to see in a second when you dive into where they are, not only is there no water for them, for the animals, or for the people around, they're in a riverbed, which means the drought is so intense, even the river is dry. Just imagine how dry it would have to get to go over the Maumelle Bridge and look down and there be no water. Like, dry. For it to hold 3 armies marching on war. And I did a little bit of research, and I was just kind of curious what this would look like. And in that season, if it's that dry, if it's the dry season there, again, you're in the Middle East, right? It's probably, if that river that they're in is that dry, it's probably end of August, early September. And when you look at historical records, the best guess for average temperature on that day, not factoring in heat index or anything else, ranges from 105 to 115 degrees, which is hot when you're in shorts and a tank top. But when you're in armor and a helmet and weaponry and packs and everything else marching at pace, no shade, no relief. 7 days, no water. At this point, it is the moment of desperation. It is hard work carrying all of those things, and dehydration sets in. Way before even you get to this point. When you're dehydrated, your kidney starts to work overtime. And when it does that, it pulls resources from the rest of your body to filter toxins out of your system. And then it starts overworking so much that it shuts down. You have kidney failure, which leads to toxins building up in your body. Other things that happen, your brain starts to swell, your joints start to swell, you get headaches. Many people, especially at this point, they say without water, would start to have seizures, major organ failure, heat stroke, and death. This is the moment of desperation. This is the moment. They are marching on a war to go rebel against a country that didn't want to send them enough sheep, and they are about to die. And so where do they turn? In the verse 10 of this, we start to see the cards a little bit of the kings. Verse 10, what should I do? The king of Israel cried out. The Lord has brought the 3 of us here to let the king of Moab defeat us. Now pause. No, God didn't. If you read these verses, nowhere does this dude ask God anything. Nowhere does Joram go to the Lord and say, should I go to war? Nowhere does God say, Joram, gather an army and war against Moab. This is his idea, and he doesn't even like God anyway. But pressure starts to mount, people getting angry. Oh, well, the Lord said. It's not me. It's that guy. You all know. We're just faithful to the Lord. He's brought us out to kill us. And then we see as this continues to unpack a little bit in verse 13. Oh, yeah. Before verse 13, basically the kings get around and one of their assistants says, hey, there's this dude named Elisha. For whatever reason, he hears the voice of the Lord, and when he speaks, it is on God's behalf. So I think we should go see him. And I wish we had time to unpack how crazy it is that 3 kings of nation states went to a prophet instead of summoned him. There's a lot of implications to that, but we got to keep going. Otherwise, we'll be here till next Halloween. Verse 13, Elisha is speaking to the kings. He says, why are you coming to me? Elisha asked the king of Israel, go to the pagan prophets of your father and mother. Now, here's why this is as weird as it is. First, you don't speak to a king like that. Second off, he knows you're coming to me because I am a prophet of God. I am not a prophet of these pagan deities that you worship. You've spent your whole life worshiping Baal and seeking Baal and finding comfort in Baal and affluence in Baal. Why do you not go to him? And the reason this is so weird is because Baal's the god of rain. The one thing that they need. That's his thing. That's the one thing that they worship him for is rain. But in moments of desperation, in moments of crisis, we don't turn to what has given us comfort. We turn to what can give us hope. And so Joram doesn't go to Baal. Joram doesn't pray to the God of rain that for decades he has sacrificed to and led people to worship. He seeks out a prophet of God. And Elisha says this in the end of verse 13, just a little bit of salt in the wound. The king of Joram said, no, for it was the Lord who called the 3 of his kings here only to be defeated by the king of Moab. He didn't do that. Verse 14, as surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, I wouldn't even bother with you except for my respect for King Jehoshaphat of Judah. Basically, he says, listen, you are a hot pile of garbage, but this dude's pretty cool. We're good. And then he says in 15, now bring me someone who can play the harp. And while the harp was being played, the power of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he said this. This is what the Lord says. This dry valley will be filled with pools of water. You will see neither rain nor wind, says the Lord, but this valley will be filled with water. You will have plenty for yourselves and your cattle and other animals. But this is only a simple thing for the Lord. He will make you victorious over the army of Moab. You will conquer the best of their towns, even the fortified ones. You will cut down all their good trees, stop up their springs, and ruin their good land with stones. Elisha gives them this promise. He says, you are camped out in a riverbed, and here is what God says. He is going to fill this riverbed with water. He is going to overflow where you are with what you need. And not only that, he is going to give you victory over your enemies. He is the God of provision and salvation, but there's an interesting nuance we miss in this translation. Let's throw verse 16 back up there, because verse 16, it talks about this river, this bed will be filled with pools. But this was written in Hebrew, and when you go back to the Hebrew and get a more literal translation, Elisha says, don't miss this. Elisha says, make this valley full of trenches. He doesn't say it's going to be filled with water. He says, make this valley full of trenches. He tells these 3 kings, go to your men and dig ditches. Go to your men and say, dig ditches. Now, think about this. If you're one of the soldiers in their army, it has been 7 days since you've had water. They're on the precipice of Moab. They're right outside of the Moabite encampment. They are prepared for war, and they are dehydrated and exhausted. Imagine your leader coming to you and saying, you need to get a shovel and dig a ditch. Doing that requires you to put your weaponry down, be vulnerable, and waste your very last energy instead of conquering the Moabites on digging a hole in the dry ground. It is hard work. It does not make sense. It's not logical, and it leaves you vulnerable. But Elisha says, make this valley full of trenches. Go dig ditches. And here's what we see happen as this plays out. The kings go and the army dig ditches. They make the valley full of trenches. They do the hard work. They make themselves vulnerable. And scholars say the way this lines up, there is a likely chance that as Elisha is telling the kings to make the valley full of trenches, upriver, rain starts to fall. And they don't see it, and they don't hear the rain, they don't hear the wind. But they spend the day making the valley full of trenches. They dig the ditches. They do the hard work that doesn't make sense, that leaves them vulnerable. And overnight, not in a flood, but in a slow filling, water comes from upriver and moves on. And in that kind of heat, in the arid desert, if it doesn't pool, it's going to evaporate a lot quicker. And so in the morning, they wake up, and these ditches, they have spent their last ounces of energy digging, now have not only enough water for them, but for their livestock, their war horses, or their supply carriers, and the animals all around. God provides in abundance. Now, we need to be careful, because I'm not saying if you dig ditches, then God sends rain. It's not a transactional thing. What I'm saying is God was going to pour out his blessing on them, whether they were ready for it or not. And not only does he provide provision, what scholars say happens based on the rest of this reading, the valley is filled with these pools of water, these ditches all over. And as the sun comes up in the morning in the desert with the colored tint of the sand and the early sun, Moab looks out on the encampment of the people of Israel and believes that they see not water, but pools of blood. And so, believing that these three armies have risen up against each other, they pour out ready to ransack and loot the abandoned encampment, believing that it has been a literal bloodbath overnight, only to show up to a newly revitalized, excited, and war-ready army. God gives them provision and salvation when they should have died, when everything should have fallen apart. God moves. But if they didn't dig ditches, if they didn't make the valley full of trenches and do the hard work, they miss the move of God. And so I wonder, when you start thinking about where you're going to be in 5 years, I can't even begin to imagine what God is going to do, how God is going to move. And my hope is that you will dig enough ditches, that you will do the things that God calls you to do, even when they're hard, they don't make sense, and they leave you vulnerable, so that when God chooses to move, we are ready. In my life, I told you I was very good at being very bad at football. And so when we were moving from Mississippi to Benton, Arkansas at the time, we were choosing between Central and Benton High, and both, believe it or not, were football powerhouses at the time, which may date me more than anything else. But I was really excited to play, or I was really excited to be on the team. And as we were starting to move, I was like, yes, get me signed up. I was like weirdly excited for two-a-days, very pumped. And my youth pastor sat me aside, my youth pastor in Mississippi, and he said, man, I sure feel like God's telling me that you shouldn't do that. I was like, listen, John, I know I'm not good, but it is also very fun. I want to do this. And he's like, no. I know it doesn't make sense. I was like, no, but like I'm going to be missional in the locker room. You know all the people, all my friends that I've brought to our service, and like friends of mine that have met Jesus and all this. Like it's a great opportunity for me to meet guys who don't know Jesus and show his, I know, Austin, like you're not supposed to do it. And so moving to a new city where I could have joined a team and made a new like camaraderie, a new circle of friends. In that moment, I decided, okay, I don't know what God's calling me to do, but I know that I can do what he's telling me to do, even though it doesn't make sense. I can dig that ditch. And we moved in the middle of junior year. At the end of junior year, this girl named Olivia gets up in the end of AP US History and says, "Excuse me, I have something important to say that's bigger than this class," which is not what you do. But she did. And so she goes over the map and points to Johannesburg, South Africa, and says, "Turns out I'm going there this summer on a mission trip. Tell people about Jesus. If you'd like to go, let's talk." Super weird. Like, it was as uncomfortable as it is in your brain right now. But I was like, huh. So I went and I talked with Olivia, and I was friends with her youth pastor, and I ended up going that summer for a week, coming back because I didn't play football. I had enough time in my schedule to jam-pack some classes in, graduated at semester of my senior year, and got to go back to South Africa and live there for 4-ish months. And that was where God put in my heart a desire to be a pastor and a call to go into ministry. And so the day that I came back from South Africa, I went down to OBU and changed my major from secondary education to Christian studies. 1 month later, I annoyed my way into an internship at this church because I felt like I was supposed to be here. Here we are. Going back, it did not make sense for me to quit football. Regardless of how good or good I wasn't, or was or wasn't, it didn't make sense. But God called me to do something. And so as we wrap this up, we're just kicking off our series, and the band comes up, and we're going to go into a time of worship. The question becomes, Austin, what ditches do I dig? And the problem is, I don't know. I can't tell you, this is the hard thing that God's calling you to do. I know for some, it may be relational. For some of you, God's calling you to step into a friendship or step into a relationship that's going to be really uncomfortable, and everything says move away from this, but God is saying, I need you there, even though it doesn't make sense, so that they have someone to go to. For some of you, it may be financial. You may really feel like, okay, I don't know what I'm supposed to be saving for, but I know I'm supposed to be saving this money, and I could, get shoes every so often, or a shirt, but I feel like God's calling me to set this money aside. And who knows what opportunity for you to travel or be on a mission trip or invest or equip someone who's going to do ministry that you wouldn't be able to do if you didn't dig that ditch. For some of you, it could be as simple as saying, it doesn't make sense for me to shut off my phone at 9 o'clock every night. But I know that God's calling me just to have some margin in my life, and so I'll dig that ditch. I'll miss out on conversations. I'll miss out on social media. I'll miss out on Netflix. I'll miss out on Hulu, whatever it is, but I know I need some margin, and so I'm willing to make that small change in my life, knowing that right now I don't feel it, but I will do the hard work that doesn't make sense so that when God calls me to do something, I'm ready for battle. Students, if I can be totally honest, I don't know that the rain will come. Emma and I are in a situation right now where we are having to make some of the most difficult decisions we have ever made in our entire life. And all of logic says do this, and we're looking at each other on Tuesday night and saying, oh, we feel like we're supposed to do this Monday night. I don't know what God's going to do, but we're going to dig that ditch as best we can. We're going to make that trench as deep as we can and step in faith and trust, because honestly, students, I would rather my life be marked by thousands of unfilled ditches and be faithfully pursuing God than refuse to do the acts of obedience and miss it when he moves. Would y'all stand and pray with me? Lord, I just pray with these students who are in the midst of just a crazy season with school and relationships and next steps and the terror of thinking about their life in 5 years. God, I pray for every single person in here, whether they know you or not, that as they leave, they would know whatever ditch it is that you are calling them to dig. That they would know this is the hard thing that doesn't make sense and leaves me vulnerable, that I know God's calling me to do, and I have no idea why. God, that our ministry, that our community and family would have a reputation of stepping out and believing that God is going to provide and bring salvation. Because we know, Lord, it is better to spend our entire life preparing for you to move and get to experience that anytime it happens than it is for us to live in our own world and ignore your presence and not sense when you're moving. And so, God, tonight, as we kick things off, as we start this series and dive into what our life could look like, I pray that you would give us the courage and the conviction to step out, that we would sense when you move and that we would step into that and experience you in a way that changes us 5 years from now. We love you, Lord. In your name we pray.